G'day, it's Mark and welcome back to the channel. And in this episode in our auto history series, which charts the progress of the Ford Fairlane, we look at the ZK. The ZK Fairlane was produced from March 1982 to September 1984. Based heavily on the ZJ Fairlane, which in itself was an extension of the Blackwood Falcon model series, namely the XD, the new ZK featured a new grille, which had 3 additional vertical chrome bars, which accentuated the honeycomb style inset. The car also featured revised taillights with more of a horizontal theme, and there was a new asymmetric steering wheel. Plus the interior featured now wood grain to warm the interior after some initial feedback that the earlier series was a little bit too plastic. This had been updated over various iterations of the ZJ, namely things like center consoles and center armrests, which were padded rather than sort of a harder plastic. This was also further enhanced in the ZK model. The interior trim also came in for an upgrade with a diagonal theme in the cloth interior, and leather was also optional. Big news was the addition of the Watts Link rear suspension, and this replaced the semi-elliptic springs that had featured on Falcons and Fairlanes up to this point. This new suspension provided a much better level of control, particularly over rutted roads, which were often encountered in regional areas of Australia. It also facilitated the repackaging of the spare wheel to a vertical location as opposed to flat on the floor, affording an increase in boot capacity. Other significant changes related to the availability of the different engines. The standard engine was the 4.1 litre 6-cylinder. There was an optional 4.9 litre V8, and this would be the last V8 offered in a Fairlane for some time. There was the release of the new fuel-injected 4.1 litre 6-cylinder engine, which was designed as a replacement for the V8 engines. The 5.8 litre engine was no longer listed as an available option. Whether there were any built as special orders, that is quite possible, but it was certainly not available as an option, and it was not listed in any of the sales material. Available transmissions in the 6 cylinders was the Borg-Warner 35, which was a 3-speed automatic. In the 4.9 litre V8, that was a C4. The 6-cylinder engines did have the benefit of the alloy head, and this had been released in the previous ZJ series in the latter part of its life. Exterior dimensions of the Fairlane were very similar to the ZJ. Overall length was 5,011 millimetres. I'll put the inches here as well for the non-metric. The width was 1,868 millimetres. The wheelbase, 2,947 millimetres. The front track was 1,559 millimetres and the rear track was 1,527 millimetres. Height was 1,394 millimetres. Weight for the 6-cylinder 4.1 engine was 1,490 kilograms. And the car had a fuel tank capacity of 80 litres. As per the previous model, there was comprehensive instrumentation, which included the speedometer, petrol gauge, temperature gauge, an oil pressure gauge, voltmeter, and then a myriad of warning lamps for handbrake, high beam. There was also an electric clock as standard. The cars also featured standard 4-wheel disc brakes. As I mentioned before, the Borg-Warner 35 was a standard transmission in the 6-cylinder engine, and this was available as a standard column shift automatic or an optional T-bar floor-mounted automatic. The same transmission options in terms of column mount or floor shift were available on the other engines, including the V8 and the fuel-injected 6. Ford was very successful at this point in time, having overall passenger car market leadership. Falcon was the top-selling car, Fairlane was the top-selling car in its class, the LTD was the top-selling car in its class, and Ford also had great success with the Laser, the Telstar, and a range of other products. The 4.1 litre alloy head 6-cylinder had 105 kilowatts of power. I'll show the horsepower here as well, and 310 newton meters of torque. The alloy head fuel-injected 6 had 111 kilowatts of power and 325 newton meters of torque. And that was developed at 2,800 revs, so quite good torque levels at low revs. The 4.9 litre V8, the 302, had 140 kilowatts of power and 344 newton meters of torque. Many customers did lament the lack of the 5.8 litre V8, particularly those that engaged in towing, so therefore had to opt for either the 4.9 litre engine or the fuel-injected 6. At this stage, Holden was offering its WB Statesman and Caprice models, but they didn't really offer a great deal of power as an alternative. They were relatively heavy cars in comparison. At this stage, Chrysler Australia was no more, so the 5.2 litre Valiant or the Regal SE was no longer a consideration in terms of choices in the market, and Holden fielded its WB Statesman as an equivalent competitive model, and that exclusively featured a 5 litre V8. But again, power outputs for this engine were quite poor, unless you opted for a Brock enhanced Magnum. And this was a highly expensive limited edition, limited production model. So it was not really, an equivalent Fairlane competitor. As I mentioned, the big news was the suspension upgrade. At the front, there was a carryover, independent, short, long arm, progressive coil front suspension. And at the rear, there was a live axle with trailing arms and a Watts linkage with coil-type springs. And that was mounted on the rear axle with twin-tube telescopic shock absorbers mounted coaxially within the rear spring, as well as a stabiliser bar. And look, it's fair to say that despite the fact that the ZJ Fairlane offered the leaf spring suspension, the car still handled very well. They gave a very good account of themselves. They were very rugged. But there's no doubt that the addition of the Watts Link suspension on the ZK provided an improved level of road holding, particularly, as I said earlier, on rough roads. Many country roads in Australia had ruts, and that would cause the rear end of the car to sort of hop and bounce from side to side. So this Watts Link suspension certainly made a big improvement. Wheels continued to be 14-inch by 6-inch pressed steel discs with safety rims. There was also the option of a Volante alloy wheel. I've always really loved the ZK Fairlane, and quite a few years ago now, when the cars really weren't worth a lot of money, I had my eye open for a nice ZK Fairlane to go along with my ZH. And I was lucky enough through a friend of mine, in fact David, who you've seen on the channel with his Valiants and other American cars, he spotted a beautiful blue ZK 302 V8 Fairlane out at Canowindra. So I flew from Melbourne to Sydney and then caught the train up to Bathurst and got a lift by the seller and then drove the car back to Sydney. And I've still got the car to this day. Had power windows fitted, which was certainly an option on the ZK Fairlane. And I'm really glad I did buy that car because they've certainly gone up in value considerably since. Although that's not why I buy the cars. I buy the cars because I love them. It's not because of any sort of commercial gain, but hey, it doesn't hurt if the cars go up in value. Standard Fairlane was a pretty good car, and you could see why it was actually market leader. So you got the 4.1 alloy head 2 6-cylinder engine as standard, and that had the two-stage carburetor, a viscous clutch cooling fan, electronic ignition. It had a 3-speed automatic transmission, the Watts Link rear suspension, 4 wheel covers, 4 disc brakes, as I mentioned, the Beaumont cloth seat facings with a diagonal pattern, tinted laminated windscreen, tinted side and rear glass, electric remote control boot release, cut pile carpeting, limited slip differential, power steering. It had electrically operated exterior rear view mirrors, that was also new, twin quartz halogen headlamps, that was carried over from the previous ZJ, the new steering wheel design, illuminated entry system, so you lift the door handle up and the key illuminates. That was also it was an American offered component that I think was just picked up by Ford Australia. The bucket seats with lumbar support, also driver's seat cushion angle adjustment, integrated factory air conditioning, an AM/FM stereo cassette player, power antenna, comprehensive instrumentation, as I mentioned before, those wood grain updates over the ZJ, and LED digital clock. So, it was actually quite a nice car. And then there were a range of options as well. And these options included power windows, which were featured on my Fairlane, power door locks, a power-operated moonroof, the alloy road wheels. There was a Philips premium sound system, which was similar to what was fitted to the LTD. A centerfold front seat, so in other words, you could have a bench seat with a column shift, so you could fit 6 people in the car. Leather-facing seats, and also various towing packs. The 4.1 litre 3-speed automatic was quoted as having a city cycle of 20.9 miles per gallon, which is 13.5 litres per 100, and a highway cycle of 28.2 miles per gallon, or 10 litres per 100. I remember my mate Peter, his dad always bought Fairlanes. Before I knew him, he had ZGs and ZHs. He had a ZJ, and then he bought the ZK Fairlane, exactly the same as what was on the brochure. It was a fuel-injected 6, and it was that metallic green. And he was very happy with the car. And it's funny when, seeing somebody's dad who kind of lived up to the advertising, where people would say, oh, this is my 4th Fairlane or my 5th Fairlane, or that type of thing. And, it actually did happen. Ford were also, with the release of the fuel-injected 6-cylinder, trying to convince customers to move to that fuel-injected engine in lieu of the V8s, because they'd been used to V8 since basically Fairlane had been launched, even though there were 6 cylinders available in different models over the years in the customs. They didn't really represent a lot in terms of sales. So Ford put out a power and torque curve comparison, and was showing, 0 to 100 or 60 kilometres an hour, the 4.1 EFI 6 taking 10.9 seconds, and the 302 V8 taking 10.8, it's only 0.1 of a second better. And then 0 to 80 kilometres an hour, 19 seconds for the EFI 6 versus 18.4 for the V8. I mean, that is quite a big difference, actually. It's like 0.6 of a second. But, these are some of the things that they knew they had to do to try and convince people to come across. And look, I think in the main, even though Ford should never have dropped the V8, that was a big mistake. But in the main, they did maintain their market leadership. It didn't really hurt their sales, but I think it did hurt their performance and brand image in later years, and Holden took advantage of that. And you have to keep in mind that, a lot of these changes were born out of the fact that fuel had gone up in price quite a bit. There was a big move to smaller cars, particularly 4 cylinders, amongst fleets as well. So Ford really, moved with the times in their own mind to sort of, keep relevant in the market. They also put out a comparison with the introduction of the EFI engine of a 4.1 fuel economy, EFI economy, the standard carburetor 4.1 economy, and the 4.9 V8 economy. So I've just put that chart here so you can see the comparisons. You can freeze frame that if you want to read that in more detail. In terms of limited editions, there was a return of the Fairlane Sportsman, which had the Volante alloy wheels, the two-tone paintwork as well. That was available in charcoal over silver, Hermitage, which is a red over silver, and Galaxy Blue over Wedgwood Blue. They were really nice looking cars. They had, as I say, the two-tone. They had the unique interior trim and power windows, and those cars did sell well. Those limited editions, they did always do well for Ford. And then Ford had another limited edition, which was a Fairlane Classic. I'm not quite sure why they didn't just stick with the Sportsman, because that had an established, series of models since ZH. And the Classic was actually a nameplate that they applied to Falcon special editions later on, so I don't quite know why they applied that to the Fairlane model. The Fairlane Classic was very much along the lines of a Sportsman. This one had available two tones in green jade over silver, charcoal, which is a very dark grey over silver, and then ice blue over silver. Again, the power windows, the special interior trim. The 4.1 litre engine was standard, but you could also option in the Classic fuel injected 6-cylinder, power windows and locks, and also a small number were built with moonroof and also premium sound. But the vast majority of the production that Ford did, they did have the EFI engine, the windows, the locks. You would be able to find the odd base model which didn't have those options, but most of them were built that way. And by this stage of the model lineup, there were no more V8s. There are only 6 cylinders in those Classics. There is some conjecture around, when the last of the V8s were made. There's been some with a build plate around then. If you've got a V8 Fairlane with a build plate later than that, drop that in the comments. It'd be interesting to see when those cars were built. And equally, if somebody's got a 5.8 factory with the compliance plate code, that also would be interesting. That would be very rare. I know they did build a Fairmont Ghia 5.8 for the managing director of Ford, but that was a one-off build. And equally so, there may well have been the odd car built for the plant manager or some senior Ford executive. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if anyone's got a car like that. A total of 16,896 ZK Fairlanes were built. Well, hope you enjoyed that episode on the ZK Fairlane as part of our auto history series on all the Fairlanes from ZA right through. Please hit that like button. It only takes a second and it does really help the channel. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
This is the new Ford Fairlane. It's distinctly different, with improved seating comfort and interior styling. It's a quieter car and more sure-footed, with a new Watts-Link rear suspension system. And it's more responsive, with a fuel-efficient alloy head 2 engine. Ford Fairlane, first choice of Australian prestige car buyers. This is the new Ford Fairlane. It's distinctly different, with improved seating comfort and interior styling. It's a quieter car and more sure-footed, with a new Watts-Link rear suspension system. And it's more responsive, with a fuel-efficient alloy head 2 engine. Ford Fairlane, first choice of Australian prestige car buyers.